He had been sitting on the cold tile floor outside the staff entrance of Mensa Tower since 6:02 that morning. And by 8:40, every person who walked past had stepped over his legs without looking down. His name that day was Nobody. He wore a brown coat with the lining torn out, trousers gone gray at the knees, and shoes that had split along the left side so the cold came in. He had not shaved in 9 days. He smelled deliberately of sweat and wet cardboard and the cheap fortified wine he had poured into his collar in the car before sending the driver away. The wine was the detail he was proudest of. Nobody bends close to a man who smells like that, and a man nobody bends close to learns everything. Kwame Mensah was 61 years old and worth $412 million, and he had built every CD of it from a single food stall in Makola Market that his mother had run until the morning her heart stopped behind the counter at 53. He owned the tower the staff entrance belonged to. He owned the catering company that fed the 11 floors above him. He owned the security firm whose guard had already told him twice to move along. None of them knew. That was the entire point. He wanted to see what his people did when they thought no one who mattered was watching. 3 weeks earlier, an anonymous letter had reached his private desk, claiming that the staff of his flagship building treated the poor like vermin. And Kwame did not believe letters. He believed his own eyes. So he had become a man with no name, and he had come to watch. What he did not yet understand was that someone in that building was about to teach him something he had stopped believing existed. By 9:15, he had counted 41 people. 41 who walked past the heap of him in the doorway. He kept the tally the way his mother had taught him to keep the till, by feel. Each one a small click in the back of his mind. A young man in a security uniform told him the doorway was not a hostel. A woman in a sharp blue blazer. An account manager he recognized from the 3rd floor whose Christmas bonus he had personally approved. Looked at his shoes, then his face, then walked faster. A delivery boy laughed. 2 cleaners stepped around him with their buckets and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He was not angry. He had told himself before he sat down that he would not be angry, that anger was a luxury for men who did not already know how the world worked. He simply counted, and he waited. And the cold from the split shoe climbed up into his ankle and stayed there. At 9:24, a woman came out of the staff door carrying a black plastic bag and a paper cup. And she was the first person all morning to stop walking when she saw him. Her name was Adaeze Okoro, and she was 38 years old. And she weighed perhaps 120 pounds inside a catering uniform that had been washed so many times the navy had gone the color of a bruise that is almost healed. She had worked in the basement kitchen of Mensa Tower for 9 years. She earned 1,100 CDs a month and sent 400 of it home to Kumasi every month for a daughter she saw 3 times a year. A girl of 14 named Akwawa, who wanted to be a doctor and did not yet know that her mother skipped lunch 4 days out of 5 to make the arithmetic work. Adasti wore a thin gold ring on a string around her neck, under the uniform, where the supervisors could not see it and tell her to remove it. The ring had been her grandmother's, sewn into the hem of a wrapper and carried out of a burning house in Tama in 1983. And it was the only thing in the world Adais owned that had belonged to someone who had loved her without asking for anything back. She touched it now, through the cloth, the way some people touch a door frame before they step through. She crouched down in front of the man in the torn brown coat so that her eyes were level with his, which no one had done in 3 hours. "You've been here since before I started," she said. "I saw you when I came in." Kwame said nothing. He had decided the beggar did not speak much. He let his head loll a little and watched her through the gummy slits of his eyes. "It's cold," she said. "I made too much tea. They throw out what we don't use anyway." She set the paper cup down on the tile beside his knee, and then she opened the black plastic bag, and inside it was a foil container still warm at the bottom. Jollof rice with a piece of chicken and 2 slices of fried plantain laid on top the way you do it for someone you are trying to make feel like a guest. "It's from this morning. It's good. I made it." She said this last part with a small, flat pride that had nothing to do with him. Here is what Kwame Mensah knew that Adaeze Okoro did not. He knew the kitchen logged every meal. He knew the container of food was not waste. He knew it would be counted against the day's inventory and that the shortfall would come out of the wages of whoever signed for the morning prep, and that the person who signed for the morning prep 4 days a week was Adaeze herself. She was not giving him food the company was throwing away. She was giving him food she would pay for. She had built the lie about the leftovers so that he would not feel he was taking anything from her. He understood all of this in the time it took her to fold the top of the bag back so he could reach the chicken. And something happened in his chest that had not happened in a very long time, a kind of pressure, like a hand closing. "Why?" he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. She seemed surprised that he had a voice. Then she shrugged one shoulder and looked down the empty corridor toward the loading bay. "My mother used to sell food in a market," she said. "Makola, a long time ago. People used to walk past her like she was part of the ground." She tucked the gold ring back flat under her collar. "She always said you never know who you are looking at. The big man and the beggar look the same when they are hungry. So you feed the person in front of you, and you let God sort out the rest." She stood up, knees cracking, and brushed the tile dust off her uniform. "Eat before it goes cold. I have to be back down by past or they mark me late." She did not wait for thanks. That was the thing he kept turning over afterward in the months that came. She did not wait for thanks, because she had not done it to be thanked. She walked back through the staff door, and the door closed on its slow hydraulic sigh. And Kwame Mensah sat alone in the doorway of his own building with a warm container of rice going cold on his knees and his mother's market in his throat. He did not eat for 6 minutes. He sat completely still, and his hands, which had signed contracts that moved more money in an afternoon than Adaeze would see in 4 lifetimes, lay open and empty on the foil. A guard passed and did not look at him. Somewhere above his head, on the 11th floor, his own office sat empty with a view of the whole gray sweep of the city. And the man who owned all of it sat on the floor and discovered he was crying, quietly, without sound. The way a person cries when something they had filed away is lost turns out to have been there the entire time. He could have stopped there. He had his answer. 41 people had walked past, and 1 had stopped. And the one who stopped was the one with the least to give. He could have stood up, gone home, washed the wine out of his collar, and quietly raised her wage, and considered the experiment complete. That is what a smaller man would have done. And for about an hour, sitting in the back of the car the driver brought around at 10. That is exactly what Kwame Mensah intended to do. Then he made 1 phone call to the head of his personnel office, asking for everything on file for a basement kitchen worker named Adaeze Okoro. And the answer he got opened a floor beneath the floor he was already standing on. She had been flagged twice for theft. Not money, food. 2 separate incidents, 18 months apart, logged by the kitchen supervisor, a man named Gerald Asante. Adaeze Okoro had been observed removing prepared meals from the premises without authorization. On both occasions, a formal warning had been placed in her file. On the second occasion, the recommendation, in Gerald's own typed words, had been termination. Denied only because the kitchen was short-staffed that quarter and she was the fastest prep cook on the floor. There was a note at the bottom, initialed, that read, "Watch her. Suspect ongoing pilferage. Recommend dismissal at next opportunity." Kwame sat in the car for a long time with the phone in his lap. A smaller man, again, might have felt the warmth curdle. Might have thought, so this is who she is, a thief who happened to be kind to me because she did not know what I was. The file was built to make him think exactly that. The file was a tidy machine, and it had only one output. But Kwame Mensah had not built $400 million by trusting tidy machines, and he had spent 3 hours that morning watching 41 people prove that a uniform and a name tag tell you nothing about the soul underneath. So instead of feeling the warmth curdle, he asked a different question, the question that the file had been carefully constructed never to invite. Where was the food going? It took 11 days to find out, and he did not use the personnel office to do it. He used his own eyes again, the way his mother had taught him. He had the building's logs pulled, not the kitchen's logs, which Gerald controlled, but the security gate logs, which Gerald did not. And he found that on the 2 evenings Adeze had been flagged, and on a great many evenings besides, she left the staff entrance carrying a black plastic bag and turned not toward the bus stop that would take her home, but toward Kwame Nkrumah Circle, where she walked 20 minutes to the underpass beneath the interchange, and where the camera the city had installed in 2019 and never maintained showed in grainy silver. Perhaps a dozen people slept against the concrete pillars. Children, some of them. She handed out the bag. She crouched down the way she had crouched in front of him. Then she walked back to catch the last bus to her room in a compound in Nima, where she paid 300 cedis a month for a space the size of the car Kwame was sitting in. She had been doing it for 9 years. The food she had been written up for stealing, the food that twice nearly cost her the job that fed her own daughter 400 cedis a month. She had been carrying under a concrete pillar to feed children who slept on the ground. There was an old woman who ran a kenki stall near the underpass, and Kwame went to see her himself, in the brown coat one last time, because he had learned that the people at the margins of the world see everything and are asked nothing. Her name was Auntie Comfort, and she had sold kenki on that corner for 31 years, and she knew Adeze the way you know the moon, by the regularity of it. "That one," Auntie Comfort said, wrapping kenki in a leaf with hands that had never stopped working. "She comes when the rest of them have already eaten and gone home to their families. She comes after. She gives the food, and she does not stay to be seen giving it." The old woman looked at Kwame's torn coat and his 9-day beard, and something moved behind her eyes that told him she was not fooled at all, had perhaps not been fooled from the moment he sat down. "You are not a hungry man," she said. "But she fed you anyway." "That is how you know what she is. The hungry feed the hungry. The full ones step over." She handed him the kenki he had not paid for. "Now you, what are you?" He did not have an answer for her that day. He had it 11 days after that, on a Thursday morning at 10:14, when he walked into the basement kitchen of Mensah Tower in a charcoal suit that cost more than a day's earned in 3 years, and the whole room changed temperature. If you have felt where this story has been going, stay with me. Because what happened in that kitchen in the next 4 minutes is the part Gerald Asante never saw coming. The prep cooks went still over their boards. A pot kept boiling because no one remembered to turn it down. Gerald Asante, the supervisor, a heavy man with a clipboard and a lanyard, and the particular confidence of someone who has spent 20 years being the most powerful person in a basement, came forward with his hand already out and his smile already arranged. Because the owner did not come to the kitchen, the owner had never once in 9 years come to the kitchen, and Gerald intended to make the most of it. Kwame did not take the hand. "Adese Okoro," he said. The name landed in the room like a dropped tray. Gerald's smile stayed where it was, but his eyes went somewhere else, calculating, and Kwame watched him decide which version of the story to tell. At the far end of the steel counter, near the great industrial sink, a thin woman in a uniform the color of an almost healed bruise set down the knife she was holding and pressed one hand flat against her chest, against the place where, under the cloth, a gold ring hung on a string. "Sir," Gerald said, "if this is about the inventory discrepancies, I want you to know I flagged that woman myself. Twice. It's all documented. I recommended. I read what you recommended. Then you know I've been trying to remove her for—" "Come here," Kwame said to Adese. 2 words. She came, slowly, around the end of the counter, her hands wiping themselves on her apron without her noticing. And she stood in front of the man in the charcoal suit, and she looked at his face. And Kwame watched the recognition arrive in her like cold water, the slow rise of it, the torn brown coat, the doorway, the rice she had paid for and called leftovers. "It was you," she said, very quietly, not a question. "It was me." He let the room hold that for a moment. Then he turned to Gerald, but he did not raise his voice, because his mother had taught him that the man who has to shout has already lost the argument. 11 days ago, this woman gave me food she paid for out of her own wages and told me it was waste so I would not feel I was taking from her. You have a note in her file recommending her dismissal for theft. He held up his phone, the gate log on the screen, the grainy silver underpass, the bag, the crouch. This is the theft. This is where it went. Every container you wrote her up for is under a bridge at Kwame Nkrumah's circle, in the stomach of a child who would otherwise have slept hungry for 9 years, while she skipped her own lunch to do it. Gerald's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. His hand, the one that had been extended for the handshake, came slowly back down to his side. "You watched her," Kwame said. "You wrote it down. You saw a small woman carrying food out of a building, and you decided she was stealing. Because that is the only thing your kind of mind can imagine a small woman doing. You never once asked where it went. Auntie Comfort at the Kenki stall knew. The children under the bridge knew. A drunk in your doorway knew in a single morning. You had 9 years and a clipboard, and you knew nothing." He slid the phone back into his pocket. "That is not a failure of policy. That is a failure of imagination, and I will not have it running my mother's kitchen." He did not fire Gerald Asante in front of the room, because his mother had also taught him that you do not take a man's dignity in public, even when he has spent years taking it from others. That is the difference between justice and revenge, and only one of them lasts. Gerald was reassigned out of the kitchen that afternoon and into a 6-month review, and the warnings in Adese's file were struck, and the kitchen's supervisory logs were placed from that day under the security office rather than under the supervisor, so that no one could ever again decide in private what a small woman carrying a bag must be. But that was the smaller thing he did, and it is not why Adese Okoro is part of why I'm telling you this story. 3 weeks later, Mensa Group announced a meal program. It would take the surplus from the kitchens of all 4 of Kwame's buildings, surplus that had genuinely been thrown out, logged and binned every night for years, and it would route it under refrigeration to the underpasses and the lorry parks and the market corners where the city's invisible people slept. It would be staffed and funded and permanent, with a budget line that could not be cut by anyone below Kwame himself. And it would be run with a salary that let her bring her daughter Aqua down from Kumasi to live with her at last and finish school in Accra, by a woman who had been doing the job for 9 years already, without being asked, without being paid, without being seen, on food she bought with money she did not have, for people who could give her nothing in return. They named the program after Kwame's mother. The launch was held in the basement kitchen of Mensa Tower at the steel counter on a Thursday morning at 10:14. Gerald Asante thought he had caught a thief. What he had actually found was the one person in that entire building who understood what the kitchen was for. The only one who had been running it in the way that matters the whole time. He spent 9 years trying to remove her because she carried food out a door. And he never once understood that the food going out that door was the only thing in the building doing what Kwame's mother had built the whole company to do. You can write a person up. You can put a warning in their file. You can watch them on a grainy camera and decide, from the safety of a clipboard, exactly what kind of person they must be. But you cannot see what is inside a human being from the outside. And the moment you believe you can is the moment you stop being qualified to judge anyone. The world is full of people who confuse a uniform with a soul. And they are almost always wrong, and they are almost always certain. And the man who sat on a cold floor in a torn coat to find out who his people really were, who came looking for the worst in them and was prepared to find it, walked out of that building having found instead the best thing he had seen in 40 years. Kneeling on the tile in front of a stranger she believed to be nothing, holding out a cup of tea and a lie kind enough to let him keep his pride because her mother had taught her that you never know who you are looking at. So let me ask you something before you go. If you were the richest man in the city, and you disguised yourself as a beggar to test the people who worked for you, and 41 of them stepped over you, and the one who stopped turned out to be the one your own files had marked for firing, would you have the courage to look again at what those files told you? Or would you have read the word theft and stopped right there, the way almost everyone does? Be honest, most of us would have stopped reading. The hard thing is not feeding the hungry man. The hard thing is asking where a poor woman's bag is really going before you decide what she is. Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read it. And if this story moved you, subscribe. Because this channel is for stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world steps over until the day they turn out to have been holding the whole thing up. I'll see you in the next one.